The Phoenix Suns beat the Sacramento Kings in overtime, and the referees. We'll talk about that game and more coming off of a great weekend of Suns basketball here on today's Locked On Suns.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a contributor at Suns.com, as well as Dime Magazine, and a credentialed media member covering this Suns team for the past 5 seasons. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen today and every day. We are everywhere, YouTube, growing that channel, and every podcast platform. We are free, and the best way to keep us free and to keep us everywhere is to listen like you are already doing, to subscribe just a little bit below here on the page, and to tell every Suns fan in your life to do the same thing. We are brought to you today by BetOnline. Today's episode brought to you by BetOnline, which has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. We're going to start with this game against the Sacramento Kings. As you can tell, if you are a consistent viewer, I am in a completely different part of angle from what I usually am. My computer has finally broken. The disk is fried. This is my backup computer. The camera doesn't clamp to it, so bear with me. I'm getting the angling down of whether I look up or whether I look down or what that all should look like. But let's dive right in, guys. 127 to 124. Landry Shamet, the hero of the day. I'm just going to give some observations about how this game ended, really, more so than anything else, because I think that's what people will be talking about. So start with the positive. Landry Shamet, as I just said, coming off of a screen in the left corner, right corner, I guess, and catching the ball in rhythm, wide open shot, drawn up by Monty Williams on an inbound play, and Landry gets the ball, nails that corner three, puts the Suns up, and they do not look back. But a lot before that led to that moment. And if you see the highlight and maybe you did not watch the full game, you will be wondering, where in the world are all of the Suns players? Well, I have your answer. They are all on the bench for one reason or another. Obviously, Cam Johnson still sidelined with that quad contusion. But even before the game tipped off, you had bad news. Cameron Payne out with a non-COVID illness. So you had Elfrid Payton getting the starting nod, and then a ton of minutes for Aaron Holiday, a ton of point book minutes. So that's one man down. Then Jay Crowder in the third quarter lands on a Kings player's foot. He was already dealing with his own injury, obviously leading up to this one. He finally was active, but goes straight to the locker room. That right ankle landing on another player is never something you want to see. We'll see what his status ends up being. So that's another man down. Then by the time you get to some of those final moments in overtime, you also have both DeAndre Ayton and JaVale McGee having fouled out of this game. The Kings in this game took 36 free throws. By the end, the Suns ended up taking 27, but that disparity was, I want to say, 10 for most of the game. Going forward from there, you get Devin Booker fouling out in overtime, finishing with just 37 minutes played. And so those final plays, those final moments, after Booker actually hits a just absurd fadeaway, falling to his right baseline jumper to put the Suns up to, Davion Mitchell would then make another layup on some bad defense to send the game to overtime. That's when Booker gets that foul that puts him on the bench. And then you are faced with the situation where getting to overtime and everything else was a heavy dose of Devin Booker. It was obviously some major production from Ayton and McGee, who combined for 26 points and 17 rebounds themselves. So you have Bismack Biyombo, Aaron Holiday, Landry Shamet, and then I believe Bridges and Torrey Craig were the 5 to close out the game. And then Shamet hits that massive shot. So of course, the pathway to getting there doesn't so much matter as long as the result is a good one. The Suns now just 5 wins away from a franchise record 63 wins. So you can't do too much complaining, I think, if you are the Suns. But nevertheless, the free throw thing will be the story. It definitely was getting a little bit absurd. I am never one that really likes when the Suns mess around and complain to the referees and play the blame game in that way. It tends to distract them. It tends to be pretty negative. It tends to be an albatross around their necks when they're worried about that stuff too much. But I think anyone watching would have understood how silly it became. The Kings also won a challenge, whereas the Suns got a pretty ticky-tack. I mean, it was a foul on DeAndre Ayton against Damian Jones on a key offensive rebound putback situation at the end of regulation. I believe that actually was Ayton's sixth foul. And then the Kings win their challenge, I think on an out-of-bounds call. Booker, I think that last foul was just straight-up frustration at a certain point. So that will be the story. I tend to agree the Suns couldn't get out from underneath of that. The referees, I don't know if they were in their own head. I don't know if there will be things on the last 2 minutes report, but whether it was real or imagined, that became the tone of the game. And at that point, it almost doesn't matter whether the calls are actually wrong or right or anything. That's what the feeling is, I'm sure, on the court in that moment. So, credit to the Suns for overcoming that, because normally that does tend to be a distraction. And I think maybe even last year, the year before, definitely, they would have lost that game. Booker would have been in his head. He would not have performed the way that he did with 31 points in this game and hitting that last second shot. He would have taken himself mentally and psychologically out of it by getting so caught up in the arguing. The last observation I'll have here, again, a win is a win. I'm not taking it away from them, and I'm certainly not going to be one to really poke too many holes in it, especially with that record on the line. But the last thing here is, I don't understand why there was nobody as far as a big man goes on the floor for that Davion Mitchell layup where they were able to tie the game. I don't get what the thinking is. I understand that the idea was to switch everything, but all it then took was Damian Jones to be at the free throw line, pull his man away from the basket, and then you have Landry Shamet, who doesn't want to foul, you can tell, and doesn't have the size to contest a shot. He is somehow in the help position on the weak side, rotating over under the basket to try to stop a layup attempt from Mitchell, and that's clearly not going to happen. So obviously everything, hindsight is 2020, but at the same time, just strange to when a team is only going to need 2 points, that you wouldn't have a player out there to protect the basket. At least a little bit more size. Ish Wainwright or maybe Bismack Biyombo, who's a better option to kind of switch out onto the perimeter than maybe JaVale McGee might have been. But strange decision there, and it could have cost the Suns, the game in a small way. It didn't end up mattering because, again, a win is a win. So we will not belabor it too much. I want to play Correcting the Record here next. That is the segment we will move on to, and it has to do with Devin Booker and the talking point that's been circulating about his defense. I'm going to kind of set the record straight and tell you what's what. First, though, guys, this is the time of year we all are slacking on our New Year's resolutions, but Built Bar can be a solution for that problem because they are delicious. They have a flavor for everybody, and they make it easy to eat right. They make it easy to fuel your body the right way. And what's not to like? There's a flavor for everybody. As I said, strawberry, raspberry for maybe the fruit side of things, the citrusy side of things. Orange, of course, available as well. Or the darker chocolate. Maybe you like double chocolate. Maybe you like mint brownie or salted caramel. That is in there as well. They're all covered in 100% chocolate, all soft and easy to chew, and all packed with protein and light on both sugar and calories. Built Bar worries about taste first, and then they figure out how to make it healthy, and they do it every single time. Go to Built.com, use the promo code LOCK15 to get 15% off your next order, guys. That's not first order, that's next order. So you can double dip here. Again, promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com. Moving right along here, there has been a talking point going around on the internet and even made its way onto the broadcast, and that is why I decided it was absolutely necessary. It was absolutely time to play the first ever edition on the Locked On Suns podcast of setting the record straight, correcting the record. We'll decide. We'll workshop that. We'll see which one we end up going with. But here's the stat. It's courtesy of StatMuse, which I tend to really like. Devin Booker has the lowest defensive rating by a shooting guard this season with a 107.8 rating. First of all, it's very difficult to find that number in a different place. Basketball Reference has it at 108, which, okay. But NBA.com, it did not have it listed that way. He was below a lot of his teammates. He was still fairly high, but I believe Cameron Payne was ahead of him. And they don't do it by shooting guard. They do it by just guard. So a little bit messy. So the discrepancy between where you're looking is already one part of why that's a problem. The second part of why that's a problem is it's being used to say that Devin Booker is the best, playing the best defense from a statistical standpoint in the whole NBA at the shooting guard position this season. Now, I am not the type of person who's going to come on this podcast and make the case for why Devin Booker is not good at playing defense or why he hasn't improved. I completely think both of those things, as a matter of fact. I fully believe he's improved by leaps and bounds over from 2 years ago with Ricky Rubio to last year, the first season with Chris Paul, to this year. I think he's gotten better all three of those seasons, but that's not the way to prove it. And it actually oversells and it creates a false narrative that I think will actually hurt Devin Booker in the long run, because anybody who knows anything about stats knows that that stat is not what tells you if a player is good or bad. So that's the next part we need to get to. Defensive rating is not a rating like if you watch soccer and players get ratings on a scale of 0 to 10, or a game score in pitching for baseball where it calculates it up. It's very statistical and it gives a rating to the player. No, that's not what defensive rating is. Defensive rating is the points that your team allows per 100 possessions when you are on the floor. So for every 100 possessions that Devin Booker has played, the Suns have given up 107.8 points to their opponent on average over the course of the season. That's what that means. It's not a rating that is being assigned to him in some sort of mathematical way based on how well he's playing defense. That's not what that stat is. So to say that he is the best in that, what that means is, of all shooting guards in the NBA, it really means that actually the Suns are playing the best when he's out there compared to how other teams across the NBA are playing with X, Y, or Z shooting guard in the 2 spot in their lineup. It's not to say that it's not an impressive thing to consider. It's not to say that it's not substantially better than it has been over the course of his career, because it is. It's pretty, any way you slice it, it's better than it's been. The defensive rating, some of these all-encompassing metrics that actually do give you a rating based on your defense, which I'll get to, all of them say that Booker has improved. And so that's part of the pie, but it's not the whole entire pie. It's just one slice. So again, it's a false way to describe what's actually improved. And I think that it doesn't serve him well, because it doesn't tell you what he's actually getting better at. It just tells you, hey, the Suns are playing really well defensively when Booker is out there. The reason that is not useful really is because the Suns have been basically the best defense in the NBA since the All-Star break. They're a top 3 defense over the course of the NBA season. So of course, anywhere you look, most of their players are going to have a high defensive rating because they play good defense all the time, because they're a great defensive team. Frank Kaminsky was a guy, when I was just looking at the straight up everybody in the NBA, let's sort them out by lowest defensive rating down at the bottom to highest. Frank Kaminsky was up there. If you remember, the Suns were playing incredible basketball from a statistical standpoint when he was out there at the beginning of the season. Does that mean Frank Kaminsky is one of the best defenders in the NBA? No, it means he plays for the Suns and they have a really good defense, and he benefits from that when you look at that particular stat. That is the problem here. That's what we're talking about. So that's why it's not really an accurate way, and it doesn't even give a lot of credit to Devin Booker at all. It's not even telling you anything about what he's doing defensively or why he's effective or anything. So let's do that. Let's actually tell that story. Now that I've corrected the record, let's actually tell that story. You go to cleaning the glass. It shows that the Suns defense still tends to be better when he's not on the floor, although that's also a little bit difficult because they've always, since Chris Paul got to the Suns, their bench has been incredible. They tend to just blow teams out because they're so deep. They have so much versatility on their bench. So what that means is that when Booker's not out there, a lot of the numbers might look a little bit better. Offensively, not so much. Defensively, it's a little bit cloudy. But it still shows, compared to last season, the defense is not quite as much better when he's on the bench as it used to be. So it means, okay, well, there seems to be some sort of impact there. The Suns starters as a whole are playing a little bit better defense compared to the bench than they did last year. Well, Booker's one of the 5 guys out there. You'd think, well, he has to be a pretty solid part of that. Okay. So then you go to the defensive stats that are one player that are supposed to tell you how this player is doing. Now, those can be, take them or leave them. It's a little bit hard to measure defense. It's hard to quantify defense, but they're the best we have. And I don't know if they're in and of themselves tell you whether somebody's good or bad, but I do think if somebody's improving by a considerable amount from one year to the next, or breaking a trend that had plagued them for their entire career, then that's something to look at. So defensive box plus minus, that's the one over at Basketball Reference. Devin Booker has been, and in those stats, 0 is going to be neutral. So if you're negative, you're going to be taking away efficiency from your team defensively. You're going to be making your team worse defensively. If you're positive, you're helping. That's kind of how to think about it. Devin Booker had been at least a minus 1.3 or worse for every season of his entire career. And this is year 7 for him. This year, he's plus 0.2. So he is positive for the first time ever. You go to dunksandthrees.com, which has been getting a lot of momentum. I've referenced it in the past. I talked about it in regard to Cameron Johnson, if you guys remember, a few weeks ago. Devin Booker, in that stat, slightly positive, just like he was with defensive box plus minus. He's at plus 0.1. That puts him in the 63rd percentile, so top half of the league, but average. Not best shooting guard in the entire NBA defensively. Here's a sampling of, in just that specific statistic. So dunks and threes, estimated defensive box plus minus, or defensive plus minus. Luke Kennard is a shooting guard who's better there than he is. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Tim Hardaway Jr., Colin Sexton, Goran Dragic, Gary Trent Jr. Those are a lot of players who I'm not sure you would say are better than Devin Booker defensively, but they happen to have a better ranking in that stat, which again is not telling the full story. And it would not lead you to say that those players are the best defensive 2 guards in the NBA or anything of the sort. In fact, in this statistic, the best defensive 2 guard is Derek White. That sounds a little bit closer to real. I don't think that Devin Booker is, but you could convince me Derek White was. Sure. Dylan Brooks, that's another guy. Yeah, that would make sense. I would believe that. Jimmy Butler, this starts to make a little bit more sense, right? So that's the point here. StatMuse is tricking everybody. It's telling you that by a considerable margin, Devin Booker is the best defensive 2 guard in the NBA because this defensive rating is higher. Really, what that means is the Suns play very good defense when Devin Booker is out there, just like they play very good defense when anybody is out there. He has improved defensively. We know he's playing the passing lanes better. We know he can guard his man better. We know he doesn't fall asleep at the wheel quite as often, off the ball, reading coverages. He's there in help when he needs to be. He's swiping at ball handlers. He's in position. He's fighting through screens. You all know he's gotten better because you watch this team and you love this team and you've seen that and you appreciate it and you care and it matters. And it's a big part of why his season has been so good. But this doesn't tell you that. Record corrected. Are we good? I think we're good. All right, let's move on. One last piece of news here related to the Robert Sarver investigation. We won't spend too much time since we still don't know everything, but I do think it's worth keeping up with this story. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. But first, guys, it's that time of year again as college basketball's tournament is finally upon us. So from all the latest odds, contests to player props, BetOnline is the #1 source for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for scores, podcasts, and news this season. Not just odds, but info to inform your betting. And it's not just basketball either. BetOnline has you covered for all sports wagering info, including live betting in your favorite Vegas casino games and all coverage across all sports. Head to the website today, guys, betonline.net, or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, so we were treated to some news on the Robert Sarver front finally. It has been a while. We know that the investigation was supposed to wrap up, according to Dan Bickley of Arizona Sports, by the All-Star break. That has not happened, obviously. We heard a couple of weeks ago that the investigation law firm was getting ready to interview Robert Sarver finally. I believe that was maybe early March. We don't know if that has happened, but the latest news is that the Reverend Al Sharpton and his National Action Network have entered the picture. Here's Sharpton's quote. The owner of the Suns was revealed in the ESPN story last November, how Sarver, the principal owner of the Phoenix Sun, made all these racist and misogynist statements, and the NBA said they were going to investigate it. Well, how long does it take for an investigation when you have videos and people that come forward? My input there, I don't know of videos. So that is something that maybe Sharpton has heard about that we have not. I don't exactly know. He said, I put the call in Friday to the NBA that we want them to close the investigation and remove Sarver or tell us the timetable by our convention. That convention is April 6th through 9th in New York City. He goes on to say, we are not going to allow people to affect the culture of the NFL or the NBA and insult us and act like that's acceptable behavior. They think because it was November, everybody forgets about it, and that's why we want to put the pressure on. So we are on the Phoenix Suns. I believe that Sharpton separately had promised potential action against the league or maybe in protest of the Suns. I don't think it's been clarified if that deadline is not met, which would be in 17 days, 2.5 weeks when that conference were to happen. Now, if it is in New York City, then you could imagine maybe some protests outside of the league office, which is in New York City along Fifth Avenue. I don't know. But setting aside the specifics of Al Sharpton or the National Action Network or the April 6th timeline or any of that, the reason that I want to talk about this, the reason that I think it's important, and for the record here, Baxter Holmes reported 16 days ago that Robert Sarver was getting ready to speak with the investigators. So that was, again, early March, around the 4th. The reason that I think that this is important is it's showing that this Sarver thing is becoming representative or is being thought of as part of how people are seeing the NBA. And that starts to get complicated. I don't know if Al Sharpton has much of a history with the Suns. I don't know if he had a positive or negative or any sort of really idea of Sarver himself prior to any of this. I don't think he would have personally, but he's upset with the NBA for not living up to the progressive credentials that it likes to put out there. It likes to be the type of league that you would think none of this would ever fly in, right? An owner who, is allegedly said the N-word and had a hostile work environment and is pantsing his workers, and the list goes on. You would think the NBA, the way that it's discussed, the way that it's held up, wouldn't be a place where that would be allowed. But in this case, they're not acting swiftly. It's been almost 4 months and nothing, right? No punishments, no fines, nothing. The investigation is waiting. They're waiting to have it all play out. To me, it's like part of what I could understand about a certain level of frustration by people involved or people looking from afar is, for instance, you take the HR thing, which people who don't remember, there was allegations of sexual assault being reported to HR officers at the Suns and it not being taken care of. The HR officers basically telling the employees that they weren't going to be able to do anything about it. If that's the case, why has there not been anything done or announced at least that would reinforce the HR mechanisms within the Suns? Wouldn't you want to do that right away? Why would you want to wait 4 months? Why do you need to investigate whatever happened to make sure that the HR chain of command is working effectively in one of your businesses? That's the type of thing where it's like, why are we waiting until the whole entire investigation is over to fix that part of it? That seems like a pretty easy thing to do. Or to fine the team. I mean, I guess that's a punishment that you would want to make sure you know the full scope of everything before you were to levy it, but it seems very strange. Mike Bass, the spokesperson for the NBA, said that the investigation is ongoing and will take the time necessary to complete a thorough and comprehensive review. So I guess that's just to play devil's advocate and at least to explain why I get the sense of urgency and the idea that the NBA might be taking its time because it maybe doesn't have a lot and it wants it to boil over and it doesn't want to get the criticism. So I guess what I'm saying is when you start to compare how this is going to the broader perception of the NBA and you start to think of this as an NBA decision rather than a Suns situation only, rather than just local, it's like, how is the NBA going to handle this? And then you throw in the fact that the Mavericks lawsuit is now a part of this and there's ownership trouble that's getting worked up and thought about and criticized in a lot of different angles of sports, from the NWSL to the NFL, and you have Deshaun Watson and everything else. What I think Sharpton is effectively doing here is turning this into a broader commentary on how the NBA wants to handle allegations of racism and misogyny. And he's challenging the NBA to live up to its own standard, not just whatever a law firm finds. And when it starts to become that type of thing, if what Sharpton says and does can actually take hold as a narrative around this thing, I think it does change the perception of it, and it might affect how the NBA approaches things. And it might also affect whether Robert Sarver sees owning this team as a circumstance that he's willing to continue to take on. And maybe it becomes untenable if there's protests and constant media discussion of how problematic his tenure has been, even if the investigation doesn't necessarily find anything. I don't know, but that's kind of what we're seeing with the Deshaun Watson thing, right? He's legally cleared in the terms of the criminal lawsuit. The civil lawsuits are still there, but the league is willing, or the Browns at least are willing to accept the fact that he might get a suspension. They're basically letting the league handle it. And now it's becoming sort of a thing about league culture and everything else. It's not just a Texans story anymore, right? So I think that's sort of where we're headed with this, especially if Sharpton follows up what he's saying with action. So we shall see. It doesn't feel like this thing is going to be wrapped up anytime soon, but it also feels like it could end at the drop of a hat. It could end suddenly. And once it's wrapped up and the investigation report is put together and released, it'll happen all of a sudden. They won't necessarily tell us it's coming. They didn't tell us, we didn't have a great level of knowledge ahead of the fact that the Sarver story from ESPN was coming. So it's all been a little bit stop and start, and that's what it will continue to be. But that will wrap us up, guys. Busy weekend, good weekend on the court, strange weekend off the court. That has kind of been the case for the Suns all year long, so nothing new. Thanks for making Locked On Suns your first listen here on this Monday morning, everybody. Now go make Locked On NBA your second listen to catch up with the weekend's games around the league.